Hey everyone, welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast, the podcast that explains French law and politics to Americans. I'm Liam.
And I'm Patrick.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists dying on purpose. The cultural soul of the Nazis.
You Americans have given us lots of trouble. The sense was very evil.
Our planet great again.
So yeah, we did 2 election specials way back when. July was that? Jesus, long time ago. And we've actually had multiple people asking us for updates for a while now.
So, Liam, what has happened since those episodes we did?
So on September 5th, nearly 2 months after the left-wing New Popular Front won a surprise victory in France's legislative elections that denied a majority to either President Macron or the far right, France finally has a prime minister, Michel Barnier. So Barnier is not from the left-wing alliance, which is the largest grouping in the National Assembly with 178 seats, nor is he from Together, Macron's party, which has 150 seats. It's the second largest grouping. He's not even from the far-right National Rally, which came third with 142 seats. Rather, France's new prime minister is from the right-wing Republicans Party, which came a distant fourth in July's election. They have 39 seats and got less than 6% of the vote, but they've now got the prime ministerialship.
How did that happen?
Good question. So let's start with a refresher on what the prime minister is in France and how they're appointed, which we talked about in more detail on episode 1. But it's an important point here. And again, it's important to mention that a key sort of distinctive feature of France's political system is that they have a powerful president and a powerful prime minister, which is basically not true for any other European country, at least not to the extent that is in France. There are actually many European countries that have both presidents and prime ministers, for example, Italy or Germany or Bulgaria. But in those countries, the president is a ceremonial role, like almost completely, or at the very least, it's a non-political role. Like in Italy, I know the president is often seen as like the father figure of the nation. And they're usually very popular just because they don't really say or do anything. Like they're expected to be non-political. And I kind of think the reason probably why most of those countries have presidents is that when they got rid of the monarch, they kind of wanted to replace that with like a secular version of that. And so putting like having a directly elected but non-political president kind of took the role of like having your ceremonial monarch that is still the case in like the UK or Spain, for example.
Right. And most of those countries were content with that ceremonial monarch in the form of the president. That was not the case in France, which saw troubles with its parliamentary regime. So, with the end of the Third Republic, as it fell to the Nazis, and on return, especially under the Fifth Republic, there was this sort of belief that France needed a strong patriarchal figure who could, command the nation, if you will. And so in the Fifth Republic, that was Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah, and we went into some of the history of that, not super in depth, but the basic schema of what happened with the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic and the Fifth Republic in episode 1, our France 101 episode. But again, so the key thing here is we're not talking about the president, which is, as I assume most people know, Emmanuel Macron. Macron's job is safe and was safe in these past elections. And barring any very exceptional circumstances, his job is safe until his term is up in 2027. So this election was just for the National Assembly, which is France's lower house, the equivalent of the House of Representatives in the US. Let's go through a little bit of a timeline of what happened. So first, to recap a bit what we already talked about on our first election special, which we did right after the first round of the French elections. Again, a little bit of a refresher on that. French elections happen in 2 rounds. You have a first round, which then determines the candidates that go into the second round because France is such a multi-party system. Unless someone gets a majority in the first round, you go into a second round with the top, usually 2 candidates, sometimes 3 candidates. And so on June 9th is when this all started. The far-right National Rally won a resounding victory in the European Parliament elections. And that same evening, Macron announced the dissolution of the National Assembly. So this is a major difference from in the US, where elections are held on a regular, scheduled basis, except in the exceptional case of a politician who dies or resigns, when we have what we'd call a special election. But in France and in other parliamentary systems, elections can happen at any time that the head of the state decides. In France, this is known as an élection anticipée. In the UK, they would call it a snap election, when an election wasn't scheduled, but the figure who has the power to call an election calls a surprise election. So again, in countries that have like elected ceremonial presidents, or countries that have monarchs, it would be the role of that person. Like if we take the UK as the example, that's the prerogative of the king. Now, really in the UK, the king would never make that decision on his own. Or if he did, it would cause a huge crisis because it's sort of understood that that's a ceremonial role. But it's nevertheless his official power. It's just that he would only ever do it on the recommendation of the prime minister. So in effect,
Or in the colonies,
what do you mean the colonies?
like in Australia.
That's true. That's a fun bit of Australian history where I think it was the 70s. The representative of the monarch did actually dissolve the Australian government, and it was a huge crisis. But yeah, in general, it's sort of understood that the king will never actually do that in Britain. Instead, he'll only take a decision like that if he was asked to by the prime minister. So, effectively, in most parliamentary systems, the prime minister theirself is the one who calls a snap election. In France, that's not true. In fact, in France, the prime minister at the time, Gabriel Attal, was actually very against having elections for pretty obvious reasons, right?
Yeah, I mean, this guy was at the height of his career, and it's only...
And he knew he'd lose his job. It was 100% inevitable to lose his job.
And it's not the kind of thing you find yourself in again, although Edouard Philippe is going to try. Well, he's going to try to be president, but my point is I think it's doubtful that he will have... Gabriel Attal hopefully will not be president of the Republic. This is the highest he'll get, and he's only 30-something.
Yeah, so when he heard that...
It's like peaking in high school.
When he heard that his president was going to call an election, he was very upset. It was reported that he actually, they were not on speaking terms for a long time. But the reality is just that in France, the president holds all the keys to power in that kind of case. The president is the one who can dissolve the assembly. And as we'll get to, it's also the president who is the one to appoint a prime minister. So we talked about in that episode, we speculated a little bit why he decided to do this, and the short answer is no one knows. It still doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but yeah, go back and listen to our first 2 election specials to hear a longer discussion on that. And also, it's worth noting, so the first round of that election happened on June 30th. June 9th, he called an election, and June 30th, that election happened. And no one knew he was going to call an election. It's pretty clear that the prime minister didn't know he was going to call an election. So everyone had 3 weeks to get their act together. And that's maybe why he did it, is he kind of thought that no one else would be able to get their act together in 3 weeks. But again, as we talked about on our previous election specials, shockingly, for everyone who follows the French left did get their act together and managed to form a coalition of all the main left-wing parties. That is the France Unbowed Party, the Communists, the Socialists, and the Green Party within the space of a few weeks. That was on June 30th. The first round of the election, which we discussed in our first election special, and the far right performed well and was widely predicted to win a majority. But we did, I believe, correctly call it in that first episode that things were not as clear as they might have seemed. And a week later, on June 7th, was the second round, and a result that surprised everyone, which was that the New Popular Front, the left-wing alliance, defied all expectations and came first, although still well short of a majority. The far right underperformed. But really, the most important thing that happened on July 7th was not just the win of the left, but the absolutely humiliating defeat of the president's party together.
Yeah, I mean, that was the real story there, I think.
Yeah. They lost an astounding 150 MPs. And yeah, that's where we left it at our second election special. The assembly was more divided than it's ever been. And No one knew how any sort of government could possibly be formed. So let's jump into what happened after that. This was kind of a minor event that happened a week later on July 18th, but one that did not bode well for the left and sort of showed which way the wind was blowing. And that was that the incumbent Macronist president of the assembly was reelected, beating the left-wing candidate by only 13 votes.
Whoa, hold on. Right after the election, and this is the big thing. The left wasn't capable of proposing a prime minister, right? Because that's where the discourse immediately went once we found out the left won the election, right? Everyone was like, "Oh, who's going to be your, prime minister?" Like, surprisingly, I even feel that the center right wing media, that is most of the French media landscape, even they were kind of like, "Yeah, I guess it would make sense for the left to pick the prime minister." And everyone was asking them, "Who are you going to appoint?" And nobody was put forward because the French left is incapable of organizing. They didn't come out with a project, right? They should have come out with a prime minister candidate and a candidate for the president of the assembly. And they struggled to get the president of the assembly. They finally agreed to one, a communist man, but they weren't quick about it. They had multiple disagreements before they announced it. And then the prime minister, they weren't even able to resolve for the election of the president of the assembly. So they were already behind at that point before any votes were cast on that.
Yeah, that's true. This has been a depressing thing about both the New Popular Front and also the predecessor to it, the NUPES, is that they're just incredibly plagued by internal infighting and also like internal infighting done externally, where especially the leader of the communists, for example, and also many socialist politicians have absolutely no qualms about going to the press and saying terrible things about the France Unbowed and about Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and it's depressing. So yeah,
Just to give our listeners an idea, like when the topic of police violence came up amongst the French left, the socialists were like, the typical line, like center left, like, with cameras, whatever. France Insoumise, the France Unbowed, they were saying like, oh, we need to investigate more and do more things to prevent police violence or whatever. And then like the next day, the communists, who are again supposed to be like basically politically aligned with everybody, goes on a tour supporting the police.
the
It just
communists,
it's
yeah.
so incoherent. Like, I'm not saying that they can't have different opinions on the police or police violence, but I mean, it's almost like the Communist Party is intentionally trying to derail everybody,
It does often seem like that.
despite the fact that their platform is the closest to France Unbowed, which is the biggest left party on the ticket.
And it's a problem that they seem to openly hate each other.
Yeah.
And this is
Unlike the socialists in France Unbowed, who I feel like get along more like culturally, like administrative culture, like political culture, but in terms of ideology are deeply opposed.
it, it it's very strange. And there's also sort of like different coalitions between them, but all four of them never seem to be able to figure anything out. So I mean, yeah, when you had this internal debate about who their candidate would be, actually the first proposition was agreed to both by the communists and the France Unbowed, and that was Huguette Belot, was a woman from Reunion, which is one of France's overseas departments, and she's from like a small party. She's from like a local party in Reunion. So I thought that was a pretty good choice because, and presumably why they chose her is that she isn't from any of the main parties, and yet she was rejected.
And if the socialists had accepted her, I think with the proper PR approach, the Macronists would have had a hard time saying no.
Also, having someone from overseas France, that's a pretty good look. There's never been a prime minister from overseas France, and it's pretty rare for there to be prominent politicians who are. But the root of this problem sort of comes from the fact that the person who is obviously the leader of the New Popular Front, or at least took that role during the elections, is Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And it is presumed that he is completely unpalatable to Macron. But the problem is bigger than that, is that he's unpalatable to the socialists, the Greens, and the communists themselves, despite him clearly being the figurehead, the essentially the spokesperson for the whole alliance. And this is bizarre because normally the person who's a spokesperson for the alliance would then go on to be their prime ministerial candidate. That's what pretty much always happens. And so the fact that he was basically disqualified for almost personal reasons about him, I think, was sort of the root of this problem.
I want to just point out whatever the issues are that are inside this left coalition, surely they have more issues with who actually got appointed eventually, right? Like, surely Barnier is less acceptable than Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
You would think so. I'm not so convinced, but which does sort of get to me questioning whether this coalition even makes sense. But anyway, this woman you get below from Reunion was actually rejected because she was seen by the socialists as too close to Mélenchon, which again, it's bizarre this is a problem, but it is. So yeah, I guess then the communists threw up their hands and were like, look, we tried to work with the France Unbowed, and they then just went back to their old ways, and they jointly proposed with the socialists and the Greens, the socialist aligned Laurence Tubiana, but she was rejected by LFI, by the France Unbowed, for being too aligned with Macron's politics, which is fair enough because she's previously worked on a number of Macron appointed task forces. So this was like clearly them trying to be like, okay, let's appoint someone he likes. But I think, fairly enough, France Unbowed said, okay, but we don't need to just, roll over and present our stomachs to him just because.
Well, arguably, there's like, if you chose who Macron wanted, then there wasn't a lot of point of winning the election.
Right, exactly. Like, yeah. But they then did finally agree on a candidate on July 23rd. And they found someone that did seem like it, not close to Macron. She should have been palatable to centrist, right? Which makes sense in this idea that you're like, okay, we're going to compromise on this. We didn't win an absolute majority, so we're going to compromise and appoint someone who we like and we trust, but isn't, hardcore left-wing activist. So they nominated this woman, Lucie Castet, who's a non-aligned civil servant.
Well, to be fair, she's part of the association Our Public Services, which wanting public services to work and be good is a political belief these days.
Unfortunately, that is a partisan belief, but she's not part of any party, nor do I think has she ever been, and she's never been elected to anything.
Which is the most democratic thing you can do, by the way, appoint a prime minister who hasn't been elected to anything.
yeah, absolutely. But they did it was, given the situation, it was fair of them to think that she would be a compromise candidate.
So we're a few weeks into this, right? And we're already presenting kind of just another name, or at least that's how the public saw it. I think for all the good communication and PR that the New Popular Front does and has done, I think sometimes among this left coalition and among all previous ones, sometimes they forget that just the extent to which politics these days, especially in a depoliticized context, happens completely through PR.
Yes, and personalities.
And PR is always going to be slightly against you or very much against you because of who controls the media. So by the time you're proposing a weaker candidate who doesn't have a public image, you're already beginning to open the door for Emmanuel Macron to take an action that, regardless of how democratic or not it is, will nonetheless fly because there's not going to be enough of a public consciousness as to what's happening. Like, when you pull the rug out from someone, but they didn't know there was a rug under their feet, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
At least that's how I see it. Because I felt like it was only 2 weeks in, but to me, it already felt like, okay, I see we're losing this.
Yeah, it does feel like you should get in and try to enforce your candidate, which should have been, in my opinion, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. But that had already been internally sabotaged by the socialists, saying they would never accept that. And I presume the communists and the Greens wouldn't have either. Now, here's an important clarification. I said that the New Popular Front nominated Lucie Castet as their candidate. However, to clarify, they stated that she was their preferred candidate to be nominated. Why didn't they nominate her herself? Because they can't.
There's no campaign. There's no candidate process. It's just a question of who the president of the republic wants to appoint.
This is difficult for Americans to grasp how weird this is because this is so completely different from how it works in the US. The idea of a coalition is completely foreign to the US. It doesn't make sense within the context of our political system. Whatever party has the presidency governs the executive, irrespective of what's going on in Congress. So I think it's maybe useful to take a step back and talk about briefly how this would work in a normal parliamentary system. And it's a bit different in every country. But basically, after an election in every other European parliamentary democracy, someone has to form a coalition if there's no majority. Obviously, if a party gets a majority, they appoint the prime minister, and they then have a motion of confidence where they vote the prime minister in. But if there's no one party with an absolute majority, then you have to have a coalition of multiple parties to form up that majority. And this can be a very complex process in some countries, especially you have many countries in Northern Europe where parliament is extremely fractured, always into many different parties. That's especially the case in the Netherlands or Belgium or the Scandinavian countries. And there it often takes months to have this government formation process because it requires usually at least 4 or 5 parties all reaching an agreement, agreeing on policy together, agreeing on who's going to get which ministry, and agreeing who is going to be their prime minister. And then once they have that prime minister is appointed as a candidate effectively by, in the case of, let's say, Belgium or the United Kingdom, the candidate is picked by the king. And this is done on the basis of who can form a majority. And how this works is different in different countries. Sometimes it works that the largest party gets the first chance to try to form a majority. In other countries, the monarchy or the assembly itself, the parliament itself, appoints a neutral person called an informateur to investigate and lead the talks in a sort of non-partisan way between the different parties. But either way, it doesn't really matter because it isn't a very political decision, because what matters is who can form a coalition agreement.
Which, by the way, an informateur, I'm just imagining that practically is kind of like a parent trying to mediate between two kids who are fighting over the toy, and they're each arguing of who had it longer or whatever.
Yeah, being an informateur for the Dutch parliament is one of the worst things I can imagine. Just what a terrible job, because you've got to talk to so many dozens of parties, and many of them are run by psychos.
Just imagine being like, so you think that white people should be supreme. You think multiculturalism is good. What if we can reach a compromise here?
Yeah, I imagine that. And that's why it takes so long to form a government in the Netherlands. And then the really depressing thing to be the informateur in the Netherlands is that with the way the Netherlands has gone recently, you get to sit and help form a government between different sorts of fascists. And you get to slowly see that form, which, must be a beautiful process. You also have to be for a long time in a room with Geert Wilders, which seems like a bad deal.
You may get struck by farmers' equipment.
Yeah, and you'll be yes, true. You're gonna have manure dumped on you. Dutch farmers, they love doing that. Anyway, this is not a podcast about the Netherlands, as much as I wish it was. So the point is, in all these other countries, this is essentially a non-political process because someone has to form a majority. So yeah, there's maybe some politicking about who gets the chance to do this first, but effectively, there's only going to be one majority that ends up working. And when that majority coalition has got a candidate, that candidate goes to the parliament, and that parliament then votes to approve this candidate. And that candidate has to get a majority of the votes, and then they're the prime minister. Again, in France, it doesn't work this way at all. A coalition is not necessary at all to pick a prime minister.
Yeah, I mean, Macron could have appointed the RN if he wanted to.
That's not to say that you can get away with having a majority of the parliament opposed to you. You can't, because if a majority of the parliament is opposed to the person who's appointed as prime minister, then they can do a motion of censure on them, tumbling their government.
What you're alluding to here is kind of like the difference between asking people what they want for dinner and giving them a menu with a couple options on it.
Or saying, "Are you okay with this for dinner?"
Yeah, yeah. So like basically the French system, like the only check on the president's appointment of the prime minister is that parliament is so upset that it calls a vote of no confidence against the prime minister.
Right.
Which means that, for example, if you're a far right wing party who recognizes that the eventually appointed prime minister is not the guy you want, but is better than, say, a left wing prime minister, you can just sort of sit in the back benches, still hurling insults, but you don't have to make the government fall.
Huh, that's odd. That sounds like what's happening right now. But we'll get to that in a minute. On July 23rd, Macron then decided to impose an Olympic truce, as he called it. Look, of course, we're having the Olympics. It's a matter of national unity. How could we have talks about who's going to be prime minister during the Olympics? Which everyone pretty fairly responded, yes, but it was your decision to call elections immediately before the Olympics. Like, he didn't have to do that. But he proposed this truce, and he also declined to appoint anyone from the left. And because he said they didn't have a majority and that there was no majority in parliament.
Which, by the way, is shocking, right? Because if you believe Macron's whole thing, he shouldn't be opposed to a left prime minister. Obviously, we know now he is much more to the right than he had always presented himself as. But the idea that a left wing prime minister would immediately, regardless of who it was, would immediately be censored by the assembly of which his party has a significant portion of seats, I mean, just is mask off about where he falls on the political spectrum.
Yeah, this was a man who was administering a socialist government, as a reminder.
Yeah, and he said, his whole campaign promise was, "I'm neither left nor right." I'm sure you remember that.
Yes, of course. But what he was saying was basically, I'm not going to appoint someone who doesn't have the backing of the majority of the assembly, which is sort of pretending that he doesn't control the third largest force in the assembly, and that's not like if he appointed them, that would obviously mean they had the backing of his party.
Right, and you would also thought that he would not have appointed a party with 6%.
Well, yeah, we'll get to that. But first, we had this very important Olympic truce during the Olympics, and then after the Olympics were over, the left, of course, said, "Okay, Olympic truce done. Let's have Lucie Castet." And again, Macron, he didn't say that he wouldn't nominate her, but he kept saying, "Oh, we need this. You know, we need some sort of majority to be formed." And so on August 18th, the France Unbowed announced that they would start impeachment procedures under Article 68 of the Constitution against Macron if he does not nominate Lucie Castet. So, you know what the Article 68 of the Constitution says, Patrick? Under what circumstances can the president be impeached by the Assembly?
So under Article 68 of the Constitution of 1958, which is the current Constitution, the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, the president can be impeached if he fails to accomplish his missions and his duties that he is assigned. So that would presumably include the appointment of a prime minister. So him essentially failing to do so would potentially make him eligible for impeachment. But it's really a high level of scrutiny that's applied. So whether or not this is manifestly not fulfilling his duties, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think it was a political move, obviously.
But also, you know, they had a fair argument that it wasn't just that he was saying that he wouldn't appoint Lucie Castet. He was basically saying that he had no intention to appoint anyone in the foreseeable future, which obviously wasn't the case. But the way he said it was, you know, and I was watching an interview with Mélenchon today where he was saying that their argument for doing this was like the assembly can't be dissolved by the president for another year after the election has taken place. So if the president doesn't appoint someone, and France just has a sort of zombie government for a year until he can dissolve it again. So their argument was, well, then the only way out of this impasse is for the president to leave. But of course, again, as Patrick said, that was a political statement and not something that had any chance of happening. And the funny thing is, I looked up the current state of this, and it's still ongoing, the procedure. Like they had a reading of the text of law, like on October 3rd. So, you know, a month after a prime minister was appointed. But I guess just because this was this was formally initiated, because the first step is not to impeach him. The first step is to form something called the High Court, which is the parliament all sitting together, the Assembly and the Senate, and them together like trying the president. So it's kind of funny that, I assume there's at some point where this can just be thrown out, but it's kind of funny that the procedure has to keep going for presumably several months.
Well, and I think I haven't followed the details, but I think part of the argument also is that there is supposedly a norm by which the president is meant to appoint the party with the most votes.
It's definitely a norm. There's no obligation to do this, and it'll be interesting to see where that case goes. Maybe it'll go somewhere interesting. We'll keep an eye on that. But on August 26th, Macron began to make his intentions much clearer. He definitively announced that he would not nominate Castell. And then on September 5th, a week later, he nominated Michel Barnier from a tiny party as prime minister. And then on September 21st, the last date on my timeline, Barnier's government was announced. This is super unusual that there's a 16-day delay between the nomination of the prime minister and the appointment of the rest of the government. And apparently, according to French media reports, things that were leaked to the press, this was because there was a very difficult negotiation between Barnier and Macron about how they would divide the ministerial posts between the Macronistes, between the Together Party, and the right-wing Republicans. And apparently that already during this negotiation process, relations between Barnier and Macron had gotten so bad that Barnier almost resigned, which would have been very funny if it happened. But that doesn't bode well for their future harmonious relation. So the obvious question here is, Macron said that he wouldn't appoint Castell because she doesn't have an absolute majority and would face a motion of censure. But Barnier has even less. The new government enjoys the support of only 212 deputies from the Republicans, Macron's Together Party, and two minor Macron-aligned parties, Modem and Horizons, which I will not dignify by explaining what they are. So that's well short of a majority in the 577-strong National Assembly. Why does Macron believe that the thing that he predicted would happen to Castell if he nominated her, a motion of censure that forced her to immediately resign, will not happen to Barnier? Well, it appears that Macron has reached a deal with Marine Le Pen, ideological leader of the far-right National Rally. No deal has been announced or admitted to publicly, but Le Journal du Dimanche, which is a French newspaper, published an article alleging that Le Pen and Macron negotiated the nomination of Barnier together, and in fact, that it was Le Pen who insisted upon Barnier after rejecting Macron's preferred candidate of Xavier Bertrand. They both deny a deal having been made, but Le Pen does say that she met with Macron and made her party's conditions for not immediately censuring his nominee clear to him. So they're saying that they didn't, reach a deal where we're going to do this policy, but she did say, someone you appoint for me not to censure them will have to have these certain qualities, which we don't know what those are. Of course, it's not really a mystery what the far right stands for, but in theory, anything they agreed to is secret, which is kind of alarming. Jordan Bardella, who's the president of the National Rally, says that he will not immediately topple Barnier's government because he, quote, doesn't want the National Rally to participate in institutional disorder and democratic chaos, unlike the left.
Right. So this is all about PR, right? They can leave Barnier in place without censoring him, without having to assume the political consequences. Because you would assume the RN voter is not a super fan of, of just this right wing, center right wing, like Eurocrat kind of guy.
Well, I think you'll find when I get in a minute to talking about who Michel Barnier is, that the average far-right voter might find that they actually are big fans of him. And Le Pen said Michel Barnier seems to have the same view on immigration as we do. However, yes, this is a party, Le Pen's party, has been running against Macron for years. That's one of their big things. Obviously, their big thing is anti-immigration and, anti-Islam, you could say. But they also are very anti-Macroniste, and that's definitely an origin of a lot of their support. And now they're effectively and have supporting a government that is Macroniste. Even though the prime minister isn't from Macron's party, it's still about half of the ministers are, and the coalition that is the presidential majority, quote unquote, is overwhelmingly Macroniste. So you both have to wonder, how do you feel as a Le Pen voter that she's now cooperating with the sworn enemy who's destroying France? At the same time, as a Macron voter, you're seeing your president, who for years won 2 elections basically based on combating the far right. That was just such a huge part of his pitch, especially in 2017, but also to a large extent in 2022, saying, even if you don't love me, which no one really does, you have to vote for me, because if not, you'll get this monstrous, horrible, quasi-fascist far right. And yet, he has just reached a deal with this monstrous, horrible, quasi-fascist far right.
Some moments in politics are substantial in like their effect on voters, but I highly doubt that come elections in 2027, RN voters are going to remember this as some sort of collaboration. I think they're going to see it more as like, uh, A, like we did what we had to do, and B, they were still against Macron, right? Like they, just because they didn't do a motion of censure didn't mean they approved of it, right? And the rhetoric on the right, especially from Bardella, sort of implies that they're still outside of the government.
Yeah, and I'm sure they'll keep attacking Barnier and Macron all the time. However, I do think it's a risky play by them. When you rise as like an anti-establishment force like this, having any interaction with the establishment like this, especially the core of the establishment, which is Macron, you run a risk, not necessarily that your voters are going to desert you to go to one of the other major parties, but you run a risk that one of the many other snakes within the far right could see this as a opportunity to jump out and start a new party and say, Le Pen and Bardella have betrayed the people who voted for them. They work with Macron. They're basically the same as Macron. I'm the new thing. And I think it could happen.
That is absolutely the main risk I see as well. But I mean, we remember what happened with Zemmour, right? Like another far
Yeah.
right wing guy. Now, the context there was obviously very different, but I mean, it's RN is not like other right wing parties in Europe. I mean, their politics sort of are in that direction, of course, but they're almost like much more popular than like most right wing parties in Europe.
My analysis of this is you kind of have two type of far right voters, um, in all over Europe, but they're sort of like, how much they both form the voting bloc depends on the country. One is your really core, like racist, I guess, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's no other way to say it. Your real core, like far right type of person who's
Yeah, you have hatred in your heart.
yeah, and that's a lot of people, sadly, and it's a growing number of people. But then on the other hand, you have people who are anti-establishment and have, whether they have these views on Muslims or not, that's their main drive for voting for these outsider parties like the RN.
Yeah, and often they have latent racism as well.
Or
But
you
like
become, or you sort of get drawn into this racist far right ideology by virtue of it being anti-establishment. I think that definitely happens to a lot of people. They're mainly mad about. They started out being mad in 2017 about fuel prices, and then because there was one party that was talking to them in a language they understood, as like a rural voter or whatever, they sort of got dragged down this ideological rabbit hole. But I think the thing with Zemmour is that he was way too far on the other side, on the traditional far right side, which is not to say he was too racist. I don't think there's any such thing as like being too racist in that sphere. It was just that he wasn't anti-establishment enough. He
Yeah.
was like pure.
he was the definition of establishment.
Exactly. And so I think that he sort of misidentified what appealed to people about Le Pen. And partially it's the racism, but there's also partially that she is kind of a genuine anti-establishment figure in some sense. Like she is sort of despised by the establishment and has a sort of non-establishment background.
I think a lot of these people, like Zemmour, kind of they forget where race science fits in the far right project.
Right. It's not the core part of it. Most people, it's just a vague xenophobia.
Exactly. You have those guys. I mean, God, I really don't want the intention of this podcast to be giving right wingers advice on how to run their politics.
Hopefully they're not listening.
But like, you can only start getting to these like real. I mean, especially when he talks about like great replacement theory and getting into like the much more macro stuff that they believe are happening. I mean, it's just no one's interested in it. They're interested in the disgust that these people have inexplicably towards parts of the population, but nobody wants to. No one wants to see you pull out your calipers.
I think you get a similar thing in the U.S. with JD Vance.
Oh
Like
my
like
god!
JD
Yeah.
Vance very much appeals to a core part of really psycho Trump voters, right? But there's a lot of Trump voters he clearly doesn't really appeal to because he's like a freak and really into these things and talking about like how women, you know, aren't aren't reproducing enough and this kind of stuff that like the average Trump voter, yes, is a racist, but they're not like you said, they're not like a scientific 19th century type racist in the way like JD Vance is.
I don't want to minimize the racism, but they haven't thought about it enough. You know what I
Yeah, and
mean?
someone really getting that deep into it is kind of like what the hell, man? That's kind of weird, right?
Like most racism is just an anecdote about one guy cutting you in line or taking your job or getting or hearing about someone else who knows someone else who knows someone else who got mugged, and of course it was an immigrant according to them, even though it was probably just a white French dude. um, but you
Yeah.
know, like most people don't have like don't go down the rabbit hole, and they don't find it appealing to go down
No.
the rabbit hole, you know? Often this like deeply racist discourse is really a way of just saying a lot of other things. It's a way of saying we don't like the elite, we don't like, we don't like our salaries, we don't like, it's a lot of other things that are kind of like hiding in it.
Yeah, it's a package deal that appeals to people, and the racism and Islamophobia is a core part of that package deal. But if you take the racism and Islamophobia and you get rid of the rest of the deal, it's suddenly not that appealing to people. I think most of them don't care enough. And again, within all these far right movements, within the MAGA movement in the U.S., within the far right in France, there is a core there that is expanding and getting more and more radicalized. So there's more and more people who are this sort of deep type of psycho racists due to the media apparatuses that these parties have created, these movements have created.
Well, and speaking of the media, just think about the extent to which racist discourse flies and anything else doesn't. Right? Like all we can talk about in the US is whether or not we think Haitians are bad and shouldn't be in the US, or whether or not they're bad and shouldn't be in the US and eat household animals.
That whole thing is so depressing to me, man.
Right? Because imagine just bringing up minimum wage, just being like it should be higher, right? Everyone on the news channel will look at you like, what are you talking? We don't want to hear this stuff. We want to go back to whether or not they're eating dogs or not. It's the only place where media will even give you a platform if you say something racist.
Yes, yeah. And and the other side, your quote unquote opposition, starts to
Adopt your views.
adopt your views. And I think you see that happening in the US too, with the Democrats now trying to be like out
Right.
hard line on immigration, the Republicans. And you see it in France, of course.
Right. And if you bring up any other topic that doesn't involve like racism or just purely cultural kind of like issues, the other side is just going to bring up some practical issue, right? Like if you bring up like universal health care, the other side's just gonna be like, well, that's just not feasible. What are you talking about? But you know
Yeah.
what is feasible? Racism.
And they're much more willing to go along with this than to delve into anything economic because it's less threatening to their worldview. And I want to focus that on Macron because I think for us, because we've been deeply embedded in this French discourse for years, it's not shocking to us. And I don't know who it is shocking to in France that Macron would do this, would work with the far right. I'm sure it is shocking to some people. There must be some really naive voters of his who are actually like, "Oh my god, I didn't know he was like this." But I think most people have seen this coming for a long time. But if you're an American, you're probably actually very surprised because you've been hearing for a long time that Macron is as a liberal, especially under the Trump administration. I remembered this Political article
Oh yeah.
from 2018 that I dragged up, which called him the new leader of the free world. Again, in opposition to Trump. We know American leaders no longer the leader of the free world. So we got this liberal in Europe, and they said he's Trump's ideological opposite. And, quote, the West's most formidable opponent of the kind of populist nationalism Trump channels here. Doesn't seem that way anymore, does it? But the truth is, this is who he's always been. And he's definitely, like, his policies have moved right continuously. But this is fundamentally who he and his people have always been.
It's also a fundamental misunderstanding of who Trump is.
Oh, of course it is. But it's still like the idea that Macron was this, and this was a common view, that Macron was a bulwark against Orban, against the far right, against everything like this. And he's literally putting the far right policies in power now. He's appointed someone on the recommendation of the far right. And I hope that means that the American media can stop sort of pretending that he's a liberal. But well, I don't have a lot of faith in the American media.
Well, he is a liberal.
Okay, I mean, a liberal in the Americans, a social liberal. How is this? What is socially liberal about this? Right, like this is.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And to get people to really understand this, I want to briefly go into who Michel Barnier is. The name Michel Barnier is probably new to Americans, but if there are any British people listening, they'll be saying, "Oh, that guy." Barnier was the darling of British Liberals for a few years because he was the EU's head negotiator in the post-Brexit deals that humiliated the Tory government. So if you were a big Remainer Liberal in Britain who hated the Conservative government and hated Brexit, there was a few years there where they were all cheering on Barnier, and as he sort of like embarrassed Britain, basically. He was sort of portrayed in the British press, which I for some reason read a lot of, as a expert negotiator. I don't know how true that was, but that was the perception there was of him in Britain. And he spent a big part of his career in Brussels, where he held several different high-level posts at the European Commission, including vice president from 2010 to 2014. Don't worry if you don't know what the European Commission is. We'll do a future episode all about the European Union. Before that, he was a minister under 4 different French governments, including Minister of Agriculture under Sarkozy, and also a minister under Jacques Chirac, and a minister under the cohabitation of right-wing Prime Minister Edouard Balladur and the Socialist President Mitterrand. So he's very much an old hand at politics, very establishment, coming from one of the old establishment parties, and he used to be a Gaullist back when that was still a thing.
Yeah, he doesn't seem very much like Marine Le Pen, or more importantly, her father.
However, he started to sort of take a turn. Well, I don't know if it was a turn, but he started to take a more publicly right-wing stances in 2022 when he ran for president in a brief aborted attempt where he came third in the primaries for his own party behind Valérie Pécresse and Éric Ciotti, which, if you are at all familiar with French politics, those will not sound to you like very popular or charismatic people. Pécresse and Ciotti, I do not think are very popular politicians, and yet he still managed to come behind them in his party primary. But during this aborted presidential run, he got some media attention for making some pretty far right sounding statements, including calling for a 3 to 5 year moratorium on all immigration to the EU, pretty crazy, blaming Brexit on excessive immigration, and calling for the hijab to be banned in public places. Then he also took some more bog standard right-wing stances, what I'd call as like your classic set of right-wing misanthropic proposals, like raising the retirement age, increasing the working hour, cutting back the civil service, cutting back the welfare state, and stopping investment in wind power. So that's mostly pretty Macronist, the general sort of just like make people work more and give them less money for it. Make France more like the US, right? That's the classic right-wing position in French politics these days. But you also have it combined with these things like the moratorium on all immigration to the EU. I mean, that's a crazy stance that sounds very much like something from the manifesto of the far-right National Front. I mean, virtually indistinguishable, I would say. Now, maybe he was just saying that because he was running for election in a right-wing party, but still. Do you have anything positive to say about Michel Barnier? Well, I would say that his name is easy to pronounce in English and contains no diacritics, unlike, for example, Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Michel Barnier Sounds fine in English. Very easy to say. Very intuitive to English speakers how to pronounce. Pretty good for France's place on the world stage. Unlike Macron,
I thought it
which
was pronounced Barnier.
Barnier. Yeah, but even then, if you compare it to Macron, just like having an on, like, macaroon, Macron, no one's figured out how to say that yet in English. So the rest of the government, basically the Republicans and the Macronists split the ministries in half, basically. And the appointments generally mark a rightward swing for France, even from already a pretty right-wing government under Macron. Especially controversial has been that many of these new appointees have long stated opposition to same-sex marriage, which is a largely uncontroversial thing in France these days. And especially controversial, besides Barnier, has been Bruno Retailleau, the Minister of the Interior, which is maybe the most important role in the government besides the Prime Minister, who had some incredible quotes last year. He said about colonization, the French relationship with Africa. He said, colonization, of course, had its dark times, but it also had its beautiful times with hands outstretched.
See episode 6.
And he complained that Macron is, ruining France's reputation in Africa, which is true. But he said the reason that Macron is doing this is because Macron keeps going there and apologizing for colonization, and that's not what they want. And he said, when I go to Africa, they tell me they want a France that is not repentant, but that is strong. Pretty egregious. The beautiful times of colonization, especially.
Africa wants Trump.
Africa wants Bruno Retailleau, apparently. And then last week, he had an incredible quote where he said that the state of law is not intangible nor sacred, which is a worrying thing to come from the interior minister.
Yeah. The interior minister's main job is to enforce the law. I mean, like, he has under him the police nationale and the gendarmerie, which are the two main police forces in France.
Yeah.
And their whole job is to enforce the law. So rule of law should be at the top of his list of priorities, but nope.
And in France, like, pretty much all the police is under the direct control of the Ministry of the Interior. It's not like in the US where it's very decentralized. No.
Yeah, in the US where it's under the
direct control of your local mob boss.
I was going to say under the control of your mayor, who has absolutely no control over the police commissioner,
right?
Who has absolutely no control over the police union,
aka your local mob boss. So I mean, that's a whole nother discussion for an episode about the police. Is it better how France does it? Debatable, but it certainly doesn't seem great that the guy who's basically in charge of all the police is an apologist for colonialism and also says, this, law, what is the law really? It's kind of just whatever you want. So what will this new government do? Well, I made the mistake of listening to Barnier's what's called the Declaration of General Politics, which is sort of a speech that the new prime minister traditionally makes before Parliament, where he sort of lays out his path forward. And I don't think I've watched one of these before. He didn't really say anything. I'm sure that's not unusual. So we didn't get many specific policies from that. And I did waste a few hours listing that. So
ouch,
I'm the real fool there. But it did make it clear the priorities of the new government. What he kept coming back to in his speech was cutting public debt, a classic obsession of the right everywhere,
Yay.
but not something that Macron's really been into.
No, he's spent a lot of money. I mean, generally the people who say we need to stop spending money are the first people who spend a lot of money, but Macron really spent a lot of money, especially with COVID.
Yeah, and then taking a tough line on immigration. So again, we can only speculate now, but it's clear that immigration is going to be a big deal because that's all, the far right really cares about, and presumably that's what they reached some sort of informal agreement with Macron on, and why they wanted Barnier is his previous statements and stances on getting tough on immigration. But you also have the sort of unholy trinity of the tough on immigration from the far right, the austerity from the traditional right, and then your classic Macronist policies all coming together in what can only be a pretty grim government for France. Mathilde Panot, who's the head of the France Unbowed in the Assembly, called Michel Barnier the hostage of the far right, and there's definitely some truth to that, where they could bring him down any time. So they have an inordinate degree of control over this government. And we all know what they want, and it's not pretty. And I wanted to say, it's always described as getting tough on immigration. I think we should just talk for a minute about how, I think that's a misleading characterization of what these policies mean.
It's getting cruel on immigration.
But it's not just immigration, right? When you hear tough on immigration, you think like, oh, they're going to make it harder for people to move into this country. But it doesn't just mean that. A lot of it means being cruel to people who are already in this country.
Oh, yeah.
People who are maybe French citizens, just that they weren't born in this country. People who were born in France, but their parents weren't, which is a lot of French people, or just people who, frankly, who just aren't white or aren't Christian.
Right. I mean, like, I don't know, when you mentioned the thing about the Minister of Interior wanting to, or having said he wanted to ban the, or was it Barnier?
Barnier said he wanted to ban all immigration to the EU.
No, the hijab.
Oh yeah, no, that was Barnier. That was Barnier too. I'm sure
Okay.
that the Minister of the Interior probably said that too. I don't know.
I don't know if he said all that in the same breath, but he might as well have, right? Like, a lot of times when these people are talking about immigration, they're talking about French citizens living in France who just happen to either speak a language that's not French or look different, right?
Yeah, or just for the religion, the color of the skin. Like, this is why I find the media framing of this, and the same in the U.S., as being about immigration to be kind of misleading and distasteful. Because
well, it's like the whole Haitian thing, right? Like the whole Haitian discourse in the U.S. A lot of these people that they're that the media is going crazy about are Americans.
Yeah, and again, even if it's not like you were naturalized into America or France, like banning the hijab in public places would affect many, many millions of French people who were born in France, speak no language that isn't French, and maybe have never even been outside of France. And they might not, like, they might even be only a minority, like, have an immigration background, right? Like people talk about.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's insane. The perception of immigration to France versus the reality is mind blowing.
Yeah. Anyway, it's depressing. I don't know what to say about it besides that. We'll see what happens and what they do, but I don't imagine it's going to be anything good. What do you think, Patrick?
No. I mean, at least here we have the feeling that there was a chance for something else to happen, unlike the election that we will be covering in November. I had this idea, by the way, for the November election, to bring on a French guy who doesn't know much about American politics and just have him watch with us as states flip red or blue.
That would be great. I do think like the actual way that the election functions in terms of like the mechanics of it is shocking to a lot of Europeans. Like, people aren't really aware of that. Like, I keep explaining to people like that this because of the state I vote in, my vote really doesn't matter, or at the very least matters hundreds of times less than people who live in like Pennsylvania. It's I think Europeans really don't understand just how undemocratic our system is. But yeah, I challenge you, Patrick, to go out and find a French person who has never heard of either candidate before. I mean, there must be someone who's never heard of Donald Trump. Probably there's a lot of people who've never heard of Kamala Harris. That's not that hard to not have heard of. But just that would be really great. So that's your challenge from next month, is to find.
I'm gonna work on it. I think it'd be a good bit, but also just to like see what they find, like what we're so used to as being like normal, quote unquote, and have them be like, "Hey, wait, why did 51% of people in this state vote for the president, and the 49% don't count to the final vote?" It's like, well, let me explain the Electoral College.
Right. Yeah, isn't that awesome?
Yeah.
Well, that's all from us here at the Royal Palace Podcast.
Yeah, unfortunately, we need to cut this a bit short. We can't do a whole banter about interior air quality as I had originally planned.
That's going to be a huge loss for the listeners.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire.
Je me fais en fait la France une certaine idée. C'est ma raison d'être.
Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.